Meetings under the quorum call be suspended.
Without objection, they are suspended.
Mr. President, in this late hour of our session until September, I think it's important that we continue to pay attention to and be concerned about the situation in Syria. Today, Kofi Annan, the former Secretary General of the United Nations, announced the failure of his mission. If there's anything about the conflict in Syria that did not surprise most of us, it was the fact that Kofi Annan's mission was a failure. It was doomed to failure from the beginning. It was based on the premise that somehow Bashar Assad would be motivated to stopping the massacre of his people. It was motivated on the premise that somehow UN observers could come in and stand between the two fighting forces, and totally ignored the fundamentals of this conflict. The fundamentals of this conflict are simple. It is the Syrian people attempting to assert their God-given rights and throw off the yoke of a brutal and unconscionable dictator. And on the other side of the equation, Bashar Assad's commitment to doing whatever is necessary, including massacring now as many as 20,000 of his own people in his desperate quest to remain in power in Syria. Let's not forget that one of the reasons why we have seen heavy Russian involvement in the form of supplies of arms and equipment, continued Russian veto of resolutions in the UN Security Council that would have even imposed even the mildest sanctions on Bashar Assad, is that what seems to be some kind of nostalgia on President Putin's part for the old Russian Empire and the maintenance of their one base on the Mediterranean, a port in Syria. The Russians' behavior in this throughout, as they continued to block one resolution after another, of course, is revealing of the true nature of the Putin regime, the autocracy and kleptocracy that has now asserted its full power and weight in Russia. And in addition to that, of course, we have the Chinese joining Russia in their sustaining of vetoes in the UN Security Council. It's hard to overstate the damage that these actions by Russia and China have done to them, but it's also hard to overstate the damage that's been done to the Syrian people. Russian equipment being supplied constantly, Iranian boots on the ground, helping to set up torture centers, and continued encouragement of Bashar Assad to remain in power. And I'm not here to, again, critique this administration's abysmal record, but isn't it ludicrous? Isn't it ludicrous to base your entire policy towards Syria on the belief that somehow the Russians would convince Bashar Assad that he should leave Syria? Isn't it foolish to somehow base your policy and non-intervention on the belief that somehow a former Secretary General of the United Nations mission would succeed, when it was clear that the Syrian people were not going to be satisfied with the continuous barbarous regime of Bashar Assad, and certainly Bashar Assad was not going to give up. It's clear through Iran's actions that its rulers are playing for keeps in Syria, and they will do stop at nothing to prevent the fall of Bashar Assad. Why are the Iranians so committed and involved? In the words of General Mattis, the commander of U.S. Central Command, described it before the Senate Armed Services Committee, that the fall of Bashar Assad would be, quote, the greatest blow to Iran in 25 years. So the United States does have more than a humanitarian interest in what happens in Syria. In fact, if Bashar Assad falls, Syria loses its position as far as Lebanon is concerned. The Lebanese people have an opportunity to lose their client status of Syria, and Hezbollah absorbs a serious blow because they lose their patron in Syria. So the fall of Bashar Assad not only is a victory for the force of democracy and freedom, but it would also mean a significant advance in our interests in the region, as our major concern today remains the Iranian continued development of nuclear weapons, the path they're on that sooner or later may provoke an attack by either Israel and or the United States of America. I say that with some authority because the President of the United States, President Obama, has appropriately said that it would be unacceptable for Iran to acquire nuclear weapons. I've been, along with my friend Joe Lieberman, to a refugee camp in Turkey on the Syrian border. There have now been thousands and thousands of additional residents there who have had to flee the brutality of Bashar Assad inside Syria. I met young men who were freshly wounded. I met defectors from the Syrian army who described how they're instructed. They're instructed and indoctrinated to rape, to murder, and to torture. I met individuals who have watched their children murdered before their very eyes, and I met a group of young women who had been gang raped. I wish every American could have had that opportunity to see these people whose only reason they rose up is because they wanted to achieve their God-given rights. So what's going on now in Syria is very important, because the longer the conflict drags out, the more jihadists and foreign fighters and extremists come into the fight. Every day that goes by that Bashar Assad is in power is another day which will make it more difficult once he leaves, and he will leave, but the question is when, how difficult it will be for Syria to knit their country back together and become a functioning democracy. There is also a very serious issue of chemical weapons. It is well known, and for the first time recently, the Syrian government acknowledged that they have stores of chemical weapons. These chemical weapons pose a great threat in a very unstable region. There are various scenarios that we should be deeply concerned about. One of them is that if chemical weapons fall into the hands or shift to Hezbollah, what kind of a threat does that pose to Israel? I remind my colleagues that Hezbollah has committed to the extinction of the State of Israel, as has Iran. So what happens with these chemical weapons is a very, very important issue, and the more chaos and the more disorder and the more frustration and anger that is displayed on both sides, the more likely it is that these chemical weapons can fall into the wrong hands. And they are not located in one place. So there's a great deal at stake here. And there is one thing that I hope that we could all agree on, and that is the longer it lasts, the greater the danger, the greater the chaos, the more killing, the more rapes, the more murders. And today we have information that the President of the United States has made a decision to, in some ways, and I'm not sure the details because I only know media reports, decision has been made to, I guess the best way to describe it as I understand it, facilitate the flow of weapons to the Syrian resistance fighters. I don't know how that's done. I don't know how it's accomplished. But I do know this, that they also need a sanctuary. They need a safe area that is secure the same way the Libyans needed Benghazi, so they can train, equip, and establish a government. The resistance, as we all know, is fractured. And the best way to join them together is to have a central council that they can answer to and that can make sure the weapons go to the right place. That is a vital component that should happen sooner rather than later. I know that the American people are worried. And by the way, none of us seek to put American boots on the ground for a whole lot of reasons. I know that the American people are war-weary and focused on our own domestic challenges. Both of these sentiments are genuine and legitimate. But what has unfolded in Syria over the past year and a half not only offends the conscience of our country, it also poses real and growing risk to our national security interests and to those of some of our closest allies. I don't believe that Bashar Assad can last, even under current conditions. But I do know for sure America's national security interests in Syria will remain long after Assad's fall, and in many ways they could become more precarious because of our inaction, because of the President of the United States' failure to speak up for these people. Why doesn't the President of the United States speak up for them? I've never understood that. Because of our inaction, the people who will inherit the country in Syria will remember that in their hour of greatest need, when the bravest among them were fighting and dying for their freedom in a grossly unfair fight, America stood idly by and refused to help. As a sister of a fallen opposition fighter in Syria recently remarked, quote, "When we control Syria, we won't forget that you forgot about us." Millions of her fellow Syrians share that sentiment. If we continue on this path of inaction, mass atrocities will continue to unfold in Aleppo and other places in Syria. We have the power to prevent this needless death and advance our strategic interests in the Middle East at the same time. If we continue this shameful behavior, our failure of leadership will haunt us for a long period to come. Mr. President, I suggest the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka. Mr. Barrasso.
Mr. President.
Senator from Connecticut.
Thank you, Mr. President. I ask that the quorum call be lifted.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. I hope that many of my colleagues, in returning to their home states for the August recess, may have an opportunity to attend a citizenship ceremony. I do so regularly when I go home during the July 4th break. I had the wonderful opportunity to attend several. These ceremonies can occur in courthouses or in town halls involving newly made citizens. They swear the oath, and they are accompanied by families and friends. It is a uniquely joyous and proud day in their lives. Many have waited years to become United States citizens, and they do so not only willingly but joyfully. And there are tears in many of their eyes, and there are tears in my eyes as well, because it recalls for me the day many, many years ago, decades ago, when I first attended such a ceremony, which in turn recalls for me the stories of my own relatives who came to this country from other shores, and so did many of the parents or grandparents or forebears of we who serve in this body. The meaning of citizenship of the United States, the value of those rights that come with citizenship are often forgotten or unappreciated by many of us who have been born in this country and sometimes, unfortunately, take for granted the tremendous value placed on those rights and liberties by people who come to the United States. Today I want to talk about people who come to the United States, or more precisely, are brought to the United States as young people, as infants, or children, many under 4 or 5 years old, and this country becomes the only one they have known. The history of this country is their history. They may not even know the language of the country from which they came, and the language of this country is the only one that they know, and may have no memories or scant recollections of the countries where they were born. These young people are here, and they have been brought here perhaps by parents who came illegally, but they are here through no fault of their own. And many of them have achieved remarkably and have contributed extraordinarily. And their promise of future achievement is staggering, extraordinarily impressive. Their contribution to the lives of their communities, to teaching or giving back to our communities, their contributions in terms of scientific or literary accomplishment. One such young person is Miller Gomes. And I'm going to tell his story today much as Senator Durbin has told other stories on the floor of this chamber, in his steadfast and energetic advocacy of a measure called the DREAM Act. And I want to follow him in engaging this chamber in this effort I want to thank distinguished colleagues like Senator Durbin, who have been tireless advocates for the passage of the DREAM Act. The DREAM Act, called by its full name, Development, Relief, and Education for Alien Minors, should be a top priority for this Congress. States like Connecticut have passed their versions of it, but a national and uniform effort is essential. And much as we hope, and I support, that we will have comprehensive immigration law reform, I also believe the DREAM Act is an idea whose time has more than come, and we should be adopting it as soon as possible in this chamber to provide the kind of certainty and promise that is so important to young people like Miller Gomes. Miller Gomes was brought to this country from Brazil when he was 5 years old. He came with a tourist visa in 1995. The tourist visa expired a year later in 1996, and so he has been here without proper documentation since then. He has been through the Bridgeport Public Schools, Central High School in Bridgeport, and then he went to Fairfield University. Miller Gomes is this young man at his graduation from Fairfield University. His graduation, summa cum laude. He was a member of Phi Beta Kappa, Mu Epsilon, Sigma Psi. He won the American Chemical Society Outstanding Senior Chemistry Award. And he has been accepted at the University of California, Berkeley's Physical Chemistry PhD program. All that he lacked was a student visa to pursue his studies at UC Berkeley. He lacks a student visa, and if he returns to Brazil to seek one, he will be denied it because he has been undocumented in this country. If there were ever a catch-22, Miller Gomes is its poster child under our current immigration law. And so that student visa, under current law, will be denied him. Fortunately, the Obama administration on June 15, 2012, made a very strong statement of support for young men and women like Miller Gomes and issued a regulation or a directive that will permit him to remain in this country. That directive is lacking in a number of respects compared to the DREAM Act. It will be temporary only for a couple of years. It is not a path to citizenship as the DREAM Act would provide. It does not make him eligible for the kind of financial aid that he would need. And most important, it requires him to go through the stress and uncertainty of applying again for deferred action. It is only a deferral of deportation. And so the DREAM Act remains a vitally important measure for literally thousands of young people, between 11,000 and 20,000 young people living in Connecticut who would benefit from the DREAM Act, and 2 million young people nationwide. Under the DREAM Act, they would comply with rigorous standards and requirements for lack of criminal record or criminal history, and they would, in effect, be provided this pathway to citizenship because of their promise and their potential for contributing to this country. In Miller Gomes' case, the potential for contributing to this country as a scientist who would make new discoveries, perhaps breakthrough discoveries that would benefit the entire country. And we laud young people like him who are motivated and smart and dedicated to this country. I am committed to comprehensive immigration reform achieved through bipartisan congressional action. That ought to be one of our immediate goals here, so that young people like Miller Gomes, brought to this country as children through no fault of their own, will have the opportunity to contribute to this nation and be part of their communities as the DREAM Act would provide and as comprehensive immigration reform would also achieve. But in the meantime, let us pass the DREAM Act so that these dreamers, like Miller Gomes, will have the basic guarantees and certainty that they can remain in this country and that the promise of the greatest nation in the history of the world will be theirs, truly and irrevocably. Theirs regardless of religion or race or gender or any of the arbitrary labels that we say consistently and constantly should have no place in our judgments about human beings. Our nation will be better because Miller Gomes will be with us. And our nation would be better still if the millions like him have the security and certainty of a path toward citizenship, a path that will benefit them and benefit the greatest nation in the history of the world. Thank you, Madam President, and I yield the floor.
Clerk will call the roll. Oops. Can you?
I note the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Kaka.
The Senator from Rhode Island.
Madam President, I would ask unanimous consent that the calling of the quorum be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Madam President, first let me express my disappointment that today our colleagues on the other side of the aisle blocked consideration of vitally important cybersecurity legislation. When the Secretary of Defense, when asked about the potential threats the United States suggests, in fact, declares emphatically that his biggest concern is that the next Pearl Harbor will be a cyber attack upon the U.S., and we cannot at least procedurally move to the bill, amend the bill, and pass a bill, that I think is not performing up to the expectations of the American people. So I am very disappointed that we were not able to complete this legislation in a timely fashion this week and give necessary tools to our national leadership to protect the country against potential cyber threats. Having said that, I also want to rise today, particularly and especially, to express my profound disappointment with the Federal Housing Finance Agency's decision to prohibit the use of principal reduction by Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac as one more tool to avoid foreclosure under the HAMP principal reduction alternative. As conservator, the acting FHFA director, Mr. DeMarco, has a duty not only to carry on the business of both Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, but also to preserve and conserve the assets of both, which FHFA has repeatedly stated requires them to minimize losses. But at the same time, he has other statutory responsibilities. Under Section 110 of the Emergency Economic Stabilization Act, there is a requirement that FHFA, quote, implements a plan that seeks to maximize assistance for homeowners and use its authority to encourage the services of the underlying mortgages and considering net present value to the taxpayer to take advantage of available programs to minimize foreclosure. So there's a clear statutory direction to do all that he can to minimize foreclosures while he's also balancing the portfolio and minimizing losses to Fannie and Freddie. So to boil all of this down, FHFA has to minimize Fannie and Freddie losses, and pursuant to the Emergency Economic Stabilization Act, which, by the way, passed this chamber on a strong bipartisan vote of 74 to 25. So this injunction to protect foreclosed homes or people with the threat of foreclosure is a strongly bipartisan objective. FHFA was directed by Congress to throw its weight in favor, I believe, of avoiding disclosure, especially in those instances in which a policy decision may be a close call. I believe that's the plain meaning of maximize assistance to minimize foreclosure. Maximize assistance, not provide assistance, but to maximize assistance to avoid foreclosure. And I would further note that Section 110 of the Economic Emergency Stabilization Act explicitly permits reduction of loan principal. So we consciously gave the acting director the specific tool of principal reduction, the specific directive to maximize assistance to minimize foreclosure. We did that in the context of his overall mission to try to minimize losses to Fannie and Freddie portfolios. But to turn essentially a blind eye to the thousands of Americans who are facing foreclosure or are underwater, they may be current with their mortgage, but they're facing foreclosure, is, I think, to ignore a vital responsibility and a vital authority which he has been given. After reading FHFA's July 31st, 2012 letter to members of Congress, my impression that FHFA has done exactly the opposite of what we have asked them to do. Indeed, the letter contradicts itself in arriving at its conclusion. FHFA states in one part of the letter that it won't allow principal reductions under the PRA program. But in another part of the letter, FHFA then goes on to write, quote, short sales and deeds in lieu, which the enterprises offer, Fannie and Freddie, result in principal forgiveness as part of exiting the house. In other words, it seems, in their view, principal reduction is acceptable in some cases, especially if the owners leave their home. Now, I think there are thousands of Americans who are facing huge challenges in staying in their home, and it is more than ironic that if you're going to lose your home, we'll reduce the principal, but if it allows you to keep your home, then we won't do it. In the same letter, FHFA also states that, quote, forgiving debt owed pursuant to a lawful valid contract risks creating a longer-term view by investors that the mortgage contract is less secure than ever before. Longer term, this view could lead to higher mortgage rate, a constriction of mortgage credit lending, or both, outcomes that would be inconsistent with FHFA's mandate to promote stability and liquidity in mortgage markets and access to mortgage credit, close quote. So forgiving debt is inconsistent with FHFA's mandate, but FHFA admits to permitting principal forgiveness in certain cases. Again, let me repeat their own words. Short sales and deeds in lieu, which the enterprises offer, result in principal forgiveness as part of exiting the house. But FHFA also states, quote, forgiving debt owed pursuant to a lawful valid contract risks creating a longer-term view by investors that the mortgage contract is less secure than ever before. So how does this make any real common sense? We'll forgive principal if you're going to get kicked out of your house, which presumably upsets the long-term perspective of investors and bonds that support those mortgages. But if you're staying in your house and you need to benefit from historically low interest rates, which the banks are, we won't let you. We won't reduce principal. And turning to the point of moral hazard, which is implicit in all that's been discussed by FHA, and given that FHFA has blessed principal forgiveness in these two instances of short sales and deeds in lieu, and additionally, by the way, permits principal reduction as part of the hardest hit fund, which also uses Treasury incentives, I can only assume that FHA must have found a way to control and avoid moral hazard when they want to, and use it as an excuse when they don't want to do something. Either it's a constant issue that must be consistently defended, which they don't do, or it is a post hoc, after-the-fact rationalization for failing to pursue a policy which, for other reasons, they don't want to do. Now, having made these points, let me give FHFA a bit of the benefit of the doubt here and assume for the sake of argument FHA wants greater certainty assurances. I think they said as much as when they wrote in the letter, FHA weighed these potential benefits, of course, recognized the inherent uncertainties associated with these estimates, and concluded that the potential benefit was too small and uncertain relative to known and unknown costs and risks to warrant the dedication of additional taxpayer resources to Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac to implement HAMP PRA. Now, that's interesting, and I often hear, particularly my Republican colleagues, talk about, well, you know, what Fannie and Freddie and FHA should be doing is what the private sector does. You know, the businessmen and women, the hard-headed people that protect their shareholders, et cetera. In fact, I think that is a pretty good place to look for some direction. But what is private sector doing when it comes to principal reduction? Well, for instance, Lori Goodman, who's the senior managing director at Amherst Securities Group, a broker-dealer specializing in the trading of residential and commercial mortgage-backed securities, who performs extensive data-intensive studies to keep its client informed of critical trends in the residential mortgage-backed securities market, testified before the Senate Banking Committee that principal reductions are, in her words, the most effective type of modification. Next, John DiOrio of First Alliance Lending, whose clients consist of major banks, investment banks, and sophisticated financial counterparties, has stated that his clients are in favor of principal reduction, quote, not out of a sense of charity, but because they believe it is in their best financial interest to do so. In other words, there is a very strong business case for principal reduction, a business argument apparently that FHA has ignored or totally rejected. Now, finally, when we look at the newest data from the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, we see that banks have granted principal reductions on 28.9% of loans they hold, which is up from 11.5% a year earlier. And, well, by the way, they also have a lower default rate than Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. So when you look at the private sector, what they're doing appears to be quite different, indeed perhaps the opposite of what FHA is doing. They are going through their portfolios and in appropriate ways reducing principal, not because they want to provide charity, not because they're insensitive to moral hazard, but because it's the best way to preserve their portfolio and generate shareholder value for their shareholders. That's what they're in business of doing. In fact, they have a fiduciary duty to do that. So it appears that the private sector seems not only completely comfortable with principal reduction, but they, in fact, are doing it because it is good for their bottom line. And yet we have FHA essentially saying, well, we can't do it. It's so unbusinesslike. It won't preserve our portfolio. It doesn't make sense, et cetera. I think this is one of those examples where they just don't get it, frankly. Now, if a principal reduction provides greater value than foreclosure to a private investor like these banks I've cited, and on top of that, keeps a family in a home, aren't these the types of decisions that we should make and we should support? The real moral hazard, if there one here, is that FHFA is inexplicably choosing not to use every available tool, especially one that the private sector is already using extensively. Again, time and time again, you hear people in this chamber on both sides of the aisle say, we've got to run this government like a business. Well, guess what? The businesses are using principal reductions. And FHA is saying we can't do that. This is short-sighted. It's wrong. I urge the FHFA to reconsider. And in the meanwhile, I'm going to continue my efforts to do what I can do to help these homeowners that are facing foreclosure. It is very difficult, and I look at my colleague from New Hampshire, my colleague from Utah, to go back home and see a homeowner who is struggling with a mortgage that might be 5% or 6%, knowing that we are funding major financial institutions at close to 1% in terms of interest, and they can't get access to a better mortgage rate because they can't have their principal written down. So I hope that we do adopt some business practices around here, and FHA leads the way, and I'm going to do all I can to ensure that outcome becomes a reality. And with that, I would yield the floor, and I would thank my colleague from Utah for his consideration in letting me speak. Thank you.
Thank you. Madam President?
The senator from Utah.
I thank my colleague. He's always gracious and a very fine man, and I enjoy serving with him very much. I was really disappointed that the cybersecurity bill had to be brought, that we couldn't proceed with it today. This side had to vote against cloture. And the reason was because the Senate is not being run as an open Senate anymore. This is such an important bill. It's not just some itty-bitty bill that you can call up and foreclose any amendments. In fact, most bills are not that are brought to the floor. And I think if it were the other way around and the Republicans were in the majority and they started doing what we've been going through lately, and I don't blame President and Senator Reid for this. I know that it comes from his caucus. But if we were pulling the same type of thing, I got to tell you the Democrats would be in orbit. Because usually in the Senate, you never build the procedural pyramid until after there's been a reasonable time for debate and open amendments. And that's the way it usually done. In recent months, frankly, the last few years, they call up a bill, file cloture as though we're filibustering when we're not, and then tie up the parliamentary tree so you can't have amendments in the greatest deliberative body in the world, supposedly. And that's been very irritating to a lot of people on our side. And I would just caution my friends on the other side, this is getting to the point where it's becoming a matter of great concern to everybody and irritation to everybody as well. And I think we ought to get back to being the Senate that we all know works better if we respect both sides and their ability to be able to come up and say what they need to and bring the amendments up that they feel are good amendments. But be that as it may, that's the way it is right now. And we have to do this cybersecurity bill. Everybody knows that. And the fact that cloture was not invoked does not mean that we shouldn't return to that bill and put the time into it and make sure that we resolve the conflicts that have arisen, some of which are very, very important suggestions, and allow the type of proceeding that really the Senate has always been known for until recent years. Now, I'd like to change the subject. Madam President, recently there's been some commentary about the lack of substance in our political debates. Now, this concern that Washington has failed to confront our deepest political challenges, which are in large part fiscal challenges, is not without some merit. But I would add one caveat to this analysis. It is not for lack of trying on the part of Republicans to have a grown-up debate about our nation's fiscal and economic future. Republicans are putting forward real ideas about tax reform and entitlement reform with real numbers attached. But I would submit that only one side has put a team on the field for this debate. When it comes to putting forward solutions to our nearly $16 trillion in debt and our archaic tax code, the President and his Democratic allies have largely stayed on the sideline. Instead of offering up bold proposals to bring down the debt that has ballooned, given the President's commitment to ever larger and more activist government, they have determined to give the American people talking points that attack the wealthy and successful small businesses in the name of equality. Now, given the fiscal cliff threatening America's families and businesses, this decision to put politics above solutions is madness. But there is a method to it. The fact is, the President and his liberal allies are not able to put forward serious solutions because they are between a rock and a hard place. The rock is their base, a liberal minority that refuses any meaningful reforms of the spending programs that are bankrupting our country. The hard place is the vast majority of the American people who flatly object to the massive tax increases, and especially those 940,000 small businesses that would be hit the hardest. And, of course, those massive tax increases would be required to finance on a permanent basis the President's commitment to larger government. The bottom line is that the President is unable to come clean. He cannot tell the American people what the true tax bill would be for his expansion of government. He suggests that our books can be balanced just by taxing the rich. We all know that's poppycock. Hence his commitment to the Buffett tax and other redistributionist schemes that have been pursued by the Senate's Democratic leadership over the past 2 years, as though they're really serious. Give me a break. But no serious person believes that the Obama administration's government can be financed simply by going after the so-called wealthy. The only way to do it is by going after all Americans and raising taxes on all citizens. That is the silent plan that the President will not discuss on the campaign trail. That is the Democrats' phantom budget. And that is what I want to discuss today. When it comes to addressing our deficits and debt, only one party in Washington has been willing to put its cards on the table. Only one party has been willing to acknowledge the difficult choices that have to be made. The other side has refused to provide any concrete solutions of their own while demonizing anyone who has had the temerity to propose anything resembling a workable solution. The case in point, it has been more than 3 years, since the Senate, which has been under Democratic control the entire time, passed a budget resolution. Those budget resolutions are mandatory, and yet they just blindly ignore it. 3 years without a budget. 4 years ago, if someone wrote a novel or a screenplay about a Senate majority that refused to pass a budget for 3 years, people in both parties would have laughed and called it absurd. Yet here we are, 3 years later. In fact, the only budget proposals from the Democrats have come from the White House, and they have been anything but serious. According to the CBO, the President's most recent budget would keep the U.S. on the same unsustainable path with an ever-widening gap between revenues and spending, varying from 8.7% to 2.5% of GDP and averaging 3.2% of GDP. Now, keep this in mind when you hear the President and his allies suggest that we can get our debt under control simply by raising taxes on the wealthy. The President raises plenty of taxes on upper-income individuals and small businesses in his budget, yet under the President's budget, debt held by the public would still reach 76.3% of GDP by the end of the budget window. Now, even the President's budget, which raises taxes significantly, comes in with a debt level that is well above what leading economists such as Kenneth Rogoff and Carmen Reithart consider the danger zone of 70%. The President claimed just a few weeks ago that his biggest failing over the last 3 years was that he just cared too darn much about policy. If only that was true. But the fact is he ignores the policy experts and their warnings when it comes to the debt. Consider what CBO Director Elmendorf wrote to House Budget Committee Chairman Paul Ryan regarding the debt earlier this year. And I have to say, Mr. Elmendorf is a Democrat, but I have found him to be extremely trustworthy and honest. And here's what he wrote. Budgetary policies affect the economy in a variety of ways. All else being equal, scenarios with higher debt tend to imply lower output and income in the long run than do scenarios with lower debt, because increased government borrowing generally crowds out private investment in productive capital, leading to a smaller stock of capital than would otherwise be the case. Now, Director Elmendorf continues. Moreover, that same crowding out leads to increases in interest rates, raising the government's interest payments, and therefore further boosting government deficits and debt. A perpetually rising path of debt relative to GDP is unsustainable. Now, that's what our CBO director, a Democrat, actually says. And again, I'll vouch for the fact that he's a very good economist who, as far as I've seen over all these years that I've worked with him and watched him help our committees, is totally honest. No one can legitimately dispute that our entitlement programs, Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security in particular, are the major forces driving our future national debt. No one can dispute that. This chart right here, now this is produced by the Bipartisan Policy Center, shows the cannibalization of the budget and ultimately the American economy if we go with the status quo on health care entitlements. Now, just look at this blue line, health care spending. Under the questioning by members of Congress, leading Obama administration economic policy officials such as Treasury Secretary Geithner basically demur on dealing with the runaway entitlement spending. And you can see it's running away. In February, Secretary Geithner identified House Republicans that the administration was putting forth no plan to reform entitlements, but as he said, "We know we don't like yours," in quotes. The only official proposals we received from the President and his administration would simply maintain the status quo, a status quo that is so unacceptable that not one member of the House or Senate supported the President's budget. Not one in either body. So what proposals do Senate Democrats support? Now keep in mind, this blue line is the health care spending line. It shows Social Security, which is relatively flat. That goes up a little bit, but that's the Social Security line. The green line happens to be discretionary spending, which has gradually come down, or will come down from 2012 right here. We're going up to 2052, according to what we're trying to do. Other mandatory programs are pretty much even, but health care spending is running out of control. That's Medicaid, Medicare, and all other health care spending, but especially Medicaid and Medicare. Well, what proposals do the Senate Democrats support? On that, they prefer to keep the American people guessing. Perhaps the President will keep the American people in the dark until he possibly gets, quote, more flexibility, unquote. Democrats have not been willing to put their vision down on paper. By comparison, there's the budget put forward by Paul Ryan. Unlike the Democrats who are hiding the ball from the American people, Republicans have not been afraid to talk about the Ryan budget. Now, this is a comparison of budgets. The Ryan budget constrains federal spending and keeps it close to its historic average at 21% of GDP. Here is the House Ryan budget in the red. By exercising that spending discipline, the budget pulls the deficit down to 1.7% of GDP. Now, by comparison, President Obama's budget deficits are at 3.2% of GDP on average, nearly double those of the Ryan budget. When you boil it down, there's a $3.5 trillion more in deficit spending, or should I say in deficit reduction in the Ryan budget here, than in the President's budget represented by the blue line. $3.5 trillion difference between these two. Now that's how much the federal government currently spends in 1 year. And because of the President's failure to tackle runaway entitlement spending, that yawning fiscal gap between the two plans only gets much bigger in the out years. As you can see right here, look at how health care spending is going up in these out years from 2012 all the way to 2052. And as you can see, it's constantly going up from 2012. Now, whether we are debating the budget or the debt ceiling or tax-mageddon, one thing is clear. The President and the Democrats in Congress do not like to talk in specific numbers. Instead, they want the American people to measure specific Republican alternatives like the Ryan plan against a series of campaign speeches and attack ads. The current fiscal debate is between the Ryan budget and the phantom Democratic budget. Apparently, the Chicago campaign Sharpies have determined that it is safer to wait until after the election to finally unveil the details of the phantom budget, which just in health care spending is going to go forever up and eat our country alive. And their advice has been heeded by the Democrats. If your proposals are never written down, no one can check your math. We do not know the actual fiscal position of my friends on the other side of the aisle, but we can fill in some blanks. We know by their vicious attacks on the spending restraints in the Ryan budget and other Republican proposals that the President and his allies in Congress have no interest, zero, no interest in reducing spending. We know their income tax proposals do not add up to much in terms of revenue. Even if they let the entirety of the current tax relief expire, which is a distinct possibility given the game of chicken they are currently playing with the fiscal cliff, there probably is not enough money to be found in the income tax to pay for the coming explosion in entitlement spending. And you can see it right there just in health care alone. So where does the Democrats' phantom budget find the fiscal juice to fill its structural hole? The answer is simple. A European-style value-added tax, the VAT, or its green cousin, a carbon tax. I'm quite certain that my colleagues on the other side of the aisle will write this off as fear-mongering and fabrication. But what other conclusions are left to draw? Without significant reductions in spending or reforms in our entitlement system, neither of which we can expect from this president or the Democrats currently in Congress, there is just not enough money to be found in traditional revenue streams to cover the president's spending bill. A VAT, value-added tax, or some other euphemized form of VAT, appears to be the only option left to our friends on the other side of the aisle if they want to continue spending at current projections. Now, many prominent Democrats have expressed some level of support for the value-added tax in the past. In 2009, during an appearance on the Charlie Rose Show, then House Speaker Nancy Pelosi said that a VAT was, quote, on the table, unquote. A year later, President Obama, in a CNBC interview, expressed a willingness to consider a VAT to address the deficit. Countless high-profile Democratic strategists and advisors, people like John Podesta and Paul Volcker, have unapologetically suggested implementing a VAT in the U.S. Ezra Klein, a writer with the real cachet among liberal Democrats, expressed similar views in the Washington Post in 2009. Now, here's a revealing quote from Ezra Klein's article. Quote, "First, a simple fact. Tax rates will rise over the next decade. Even with painful spending cuts, tax rates will rise. At some point, taxes have to come further into line with spending, and that means the direction they will travel is up. But, and this isn't a fact, they won't rise within the current system. People don't trust the current system. It feels opaque and unfair, largely because it is. An increase in revenues will have to come alongside a change in the tax system, and the change in the tax system that most economists prefer and that most other countries use is a value-added tax," unquote. Now, I agree with Mr. Klein that our current tax system is a mess. But while he and other liberals see that as an opportunity to seek larger pots of tax revenue elsewhere, my fellow Republicans and I see it as a call to reform the tax code. And we disagree on the fundamental assumption behind Mr. Klein's arguments. Like most of my friends on the other side, Mr. Klein takes at face value the benefits of future spending. Notice how he uses the phrase, taxes will have to come further into line within spending. Now, his focus is almost entirely on the revenue side, with only a passing reference to the possibility of reducing spending. A VAT would increase federal revenues, but would also effectively be a tax hike on every American, including those who currently pay no income tax. Excuse me. If a VAT were imposed on top of our existing income tax system, it would likely cripple our economy by imposing new costs on virtually every purchase of goods and services in the U.S. It would hamper manufacturing and kill entire retail sectors. Worst of all, it would be the most regressive tax ever imposed on the American people, disproportionately impacting families with lower incomes who spend a higher percentage of their wages on necessities. Simply put, a VAT would be bad policy in a strong economy. But in the midst of a slow economic recovery, it would be tantamount to economic suicide. It would be jet fuel for larger and larger government. Numerous studies, including a 2010 study by former CBO Director Douglas Holt-Eakin, have demonstrated that in virtually every instance, the implementation of a VAT in other industrialized countries inexorably led to increased spending and an expansion of government. Make no mistake, the current administration and my Democrat friends know only one way of engaging in fiscal reform: broaden the base. And every middle-income family in America should know that they will get hit with higher taxes to pay for the Democrat goal of ever-expanding government control over our economy, over our lives, and over your paychecks. The contention that implementing a VAT would make our government more fiscally responsible is a dog that just won't hunt. The purpose of a VAT would not be to shore up deficits and pay down debts, but to expand the government into new areas backed by an all-new source of funding. Once again, I'm quite certain that virtually all of my Democratic colleagues would publicly deny that their phantom budget includes a VAT. For now, they want us to ignore the VAT behind the curtain and instead just listen as the great and powerful Oz proclaims that every government program can be funded and every budget balanced simply by eliminating the so-called tax cuts for the rich. But the American people are not so easily duped, and they are showing up at Emerald City looking for real leadership and real answers, not just talking points. That, Mr. President, is the real choice facing the American people today. They can choose the fiscal leadership of those like Chairman Ryan, who have put forth actual real-world proposals to bring about reasonable restraints on entitlement spending and maintain taxation at its historic levels, or they can choose the President's impersonation of fiscal leadership, which is built on a phantom budget and large-scale attacks on anyone like Chairman Ryan, who offers a real verifiable alternative. But let's be clear, the phantom budget simply cannot translate into reality without collecting taxes that go far beyond those the President and congressional Democrats publicly support. Given the limitations on existing revenue streams, a value-added tax, even with all of its many drawbacks, is one of very few logical alternatives left to the other side. If they do not plan on instituting a VAT, they need to come clean with the American people and let everyone know how they plan to pay for their outsized spending. Mr. President, regardless of who wins this election, Congress will have to do more than just click its heels and wish for enough money to pay for all our bills. Therefore, I think it's fair to assume that in lieu of a line item for ruby slippers, the Democrats' phantom budget includes levels and forms of taxation heretofore unseen in the United States. You can be sure that if it is not a VAT, it will be something equally damaging to our economy. Now let me just end with just one other thought, and that is that we all know, according to the Joint Committee on Taxation, of which I'm a member, but it is a nonpartisan committee run by very good economists, that the bottom 51% of all households, not just people, all households, do not pay a dime of income taxes. Now, we brought that about out of compassion for them, I have to say, but it means the upper 49% are paying for just about everything. Well, my friend Treasury Secretary Geithner pointed out, but yes, they pay payroll taxes. Well, we all do that. That's Social Security. But they don't pay a dime of income taxes. And I was quick to point out to Mr. Geithner that 23 million of them, approximately, get refundable tax credits from the government that's more than they pay in payroll taxes. So they're really not paying payroll taxes. And almost 16 million of them get refundable tax credits from all of us others out there, from the government itself, that is more than they and their employers pay in payroll taxes. Fact of the matter is that I don't fail to understand why my friends on the other side are looking for ways to spread the base to an unsuspecting 51% that currently don't pay any real income taxes. I think there have to be better ways of spreading the base than doing it through a VAT, which in Europe has proven to be a ready way for politicians to increase spending over and over without really any inhibitions or any real inhibitions. So what I'm talking about today is prophetic. It means, without question, that our friends on the other side want to keep spending. They want the federal government to keep growing, all at the cost to individuals. And they want to do it because that's what has kept them in power all these years, taking all of your money out there and then claiming that they are compassionate with your money when they're unwilling to be compassionate enough to keep living within our means. Mr. Chairman, I yield the floor.
Mr. President. Mr. President.
The Senator from Maryland.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed